friends, welcome to my YouTube channel. In today's video, we will be talking about data bindings and decorators in Lightning Web Component. So let's start with data binding. So what is data binding? So data binding is basically a way of establishing a synchronization between your business layer and your UI layer. That is your JavaScript controller of LWC and your templates, which is a UI part. So let's say you have certain data which is present in your JavaScript controller, or let's say you have some attribute which is holding some values and you want to showcase that on your UI or on the template. So in that way, so to do so, you will be needing a way of passing the data from JavaScript controller to the HTML template. So that is called as data binding, where you are passing the data from JavaScript controller to showcase on the UI. Now, how we do data binding in LWC? So to do data binding in LWC, there is a simple syntax where we use a curly brace and then whatever your property name is, and then you will be having a closing curly brace. So if we see that in live action, so let's say if I have my JavaScript controller in which I'm having an attribute called username, which is holding a value of, let's say, test username here. Now, if I want to showcase test username on UI, so the way of doing it is using the binding. So what I'm doing here, I'm binding the HTML template with a variable which is present in my JavaScript controller. So whatever the value that variable holds will start coming on the UI. So if you see the syntax here, I will be having one open curly brace, then your attribute name, and then a closing curly brace. So in this case, if you give any space between the curly braces like this, again, your data binding will not happen properly and you will not see your data on the UI. You might see certain errors as well. So the proper syntax is you have open curly brace, property name, and then your closing curly brace without any space in between. So if I show you this how it's working, I deploy this component to my org. And you see this is the variable name or variable value basically which is coming on the UI. So whatever the value is stored on username is now coming on the UI. So this is called data binding. Now in LWC, basically we have one way data binding. So overall if we see, we have two types of data binding. One is one way data binding and another one is two way data binding. So let's see first what is one way data binding. One way data binding is the flow of your values from model, or that is a JavaScript controller, to the HTML template. So in this case, whatever the variable value is being present in the JavaScript controller, that will be showcased on the UI, that is your HTML template, not the other way around. Like if you have any value or any variable on the UI, it will not be synced to the JavaScript controller. It is only from JavaScript controller to the HTML template. So to show that in live, let's say I have, again, I have my username attribute here, okay, which I have provided some value as test username here. Now again, I have put one input variable as well, or that is a lightning input. So it will be an input text box whose value I am binding to the attribute which is present in my JavaScript controller. Now, if I try to change the value here, like if I try to update the value as, let's say, data binding test, you will notice that this value is not being synced with my JavaScript controller, because if it has been synced into the JavaScript controller, then this value again got should have changed to data binding test, because both are using the same attribute, right? So this is what is called one-way data binding, because here whatever changes I am doing in the controller side, that is, if I make any change here in the controller, this will be reflected on the UI. But what if you are doing any change on the UI, if you're capturing and assigning the attribute value on UI, that will not be synced back to your JavaScript controller. So that is one-way data binding. So we also have a two-way data binding. So what two-way data binding is? So in two-way data binding, if a user performs any modification on the UI, that gets synced back to your JavaScript controller. Similarly, if you are making any change or if you're updating the value of any attribute in JavaScript controller, that gets reflected on your UI. So it is a two-directional, or you can say bi-directional flow of data, that is from JavaScript controller to HTML, or from you or to UI. Similarly, from UI to your JavaScript controller. So this is known as two-way data binding. And these types of data binding usually used when you're creating some kind of forms where you need users input, where you're creating the text boxes or pick list value, where user is entering the data, which is getting synced back to your JavaScript controller, you can say to your backend. Now, there is a disadvantage with two-way data binding. So basically, two-way data binding have like many to many dependencies between your model, or that is your uh, JS controller side, and your view. So there might be certain scenarios where you can end up with a cascade updating. So the scenario could be that your model or your JS controller is updating the view, and in turn your view is updating some model attribute, and then that model attribute is further updating some other model attribute. So there can be an infinite loop of updates of the attributes, because the data flow is between your JS controller and view in a bi-directional way. So it will be hard to track that which is your actual source of error in two-way data binding, because all these things are all handled by your framework, so you don't have that much control on the data flow. So this is an disadvantage of two-way data binding we see, and this also sometimes leads to your performance issue of your components. Hence, if we see your Lightning Web Component, by default it supports the one-way data binding. Then you must be thinking that if LWC is supporting only one-way data binding, then how can we use input text and all in our LWC? So there is a way of using input text, or basically passing the data from UI to your controller, that is events. So what event do? So let's say if you have any text box, and if you are entering some value, so text boxes, or you can say input elements of HTML, by default comes with many events, that is either your on key up or on change or on key down. So these are the events which you can utilize to capture the data from UI to your JavaScript controller, that we will see in action. So I'll go to my VS Code. In previously we saw that when we were entering any value in text box, it was not updating the static text on the UI, or you can say it was not updating my test username value, despite being the fact that both are same attribute, because whatever the value you were entering here was not getting synced to your JavaScript controller. Now, how we can make it sync to the JavaScript controller? So to do that, we can use a event here. So let's say if I put on change, so this is the way of tagging a function of JavaScript controller to a attribute on the HTML side. So I will be creating a function named as update event. Now, this is my function name, which I can bind to my HTML template again using the same syntax. So, if you want to bind any attribute or if you want to bind any function, you can utilize this curly braces syntax in LWC. Now, I have made an on change, and basically whenever any change will be happening in my text box, it will automatically call this function. And in this function, if you see, I am updating the username attribute with whatever value is being entered in the text box. So let's see how it performs on UI. So if you see, now whatever value I am entering in the text box is being reflected on the UI. Why? Because now I'm capturing the value from UI and I'm assigning it to the variable which is present in my JavaScript controller. And as you know that all the primitive data types are reactive in nature. So reactive means it will absorb the change. So here I have made changes to the attribute which has been absorbed by the attribute name username, and whatever now the changed text is there which framework has or basically your attribute has absorbed will now be reflected on the UI wherever it has been referred, or it has been referred as a binding variable like this, like curly braces and username. So now whenever I will be changing the value, I am updating the attribute name, which in turn is now updating the UI to showcase the new value. So this is how we do data binding or two-way data binding in our Lightning Web Components. And now if you see, you are having more control over the data flow from UI to HTML. So in case if you don't want to update, you can put your conditions here and it will not update. So you will get more power, or you will get more control over which data you want to update and which data you don't want to update. So this is how we get the data from UI into our JavaScript controller, and this is the way we create our forms and we capture the data which user is providing as an input. So this is basically two-way data binding where you are sending data from JavaScript controller to HTML and similarly capturing the data from UI into your JavaScript controller. Now let's talk about decorators. So decorators are basically used in Lightning Web Components to provide some certain additional capabilities to any variable or functions. So in Salesforce, we have three types of decorators. One is @track. So @track, this is being used to track any changes which is happening into a variable or any JavaScript variable. By default, after Spring 20, by default, all your primitive variables, primitive type variables, which are basically your string or your integers, they're automatically reactive in nature. So you don't need to use @track there. But if you have any array, or if you have any object, any JavaScript object, those still need @track keyword to track the changes or basically to absorb the changes so that it can be reflected on the UI. So our next decorator is @API. So in Lightning Web Components, all the variables which you declare in your JavaScript controller, they are private in nature. This means that you cannot use or you cannot call those functions or attributes outside your Lightning Web Component. So for example, you have a parent Lightning Web Component and you have a child Lightning Web Component, and they are in hierarchy. Now there are certain variables which are present in child Lightning Web Component. Let's say variable is username or anything, and Now, since by default they are private in nature, this username attribute you cannot refer in your parent Lightning Web component. To so we get sometimes we get a requirement where we need certain attributes from child in which we want to pass data from parent, or basically we need to expose a child attribute publicly so that it can absorb or it can take data from the outer container or outer LWC component. It can be a function, it can be an attribute. So at the rate API decorator is used to make any attribute or any function as public in nature so that it can be used outside your Lightning Web component as well. So if we will see that in action. So let's say we have a parent Lightning Web component, and from here I'm calling my child Lightning Web component. So this is the child Lightning Web component which I had created in my previous sessions. And now, if I get some requirement that from parent I need to pass the data to the child. So for that, I will be needing one attribute in which I can assign the value. So here I have an attribute named as username. Now, if I go to my child Lightning Web component, you can see that I have defined an attribute called username and given it as at the rate API. So if you want to include at the rate API, you can import in your first statement along with Lightning element, and then you can just mention at the rate API and your attribute name which you want to make it as public. So by defining at the rate API, I have made username as public. So now this can be utilized outside your Lightning Web component. That is basically a child Lightning Web component. Now, here, since my attribute is made as public, now I can pass the data from parent to child using the public attribute which I have in my child Lightning Web component. So, if I show you this in action, so this is a tab which I have created for my container, and if I just refresh this tab, you can see the value or the text which I'm getting is the one which I passed from my parent and not the default one which I have kept on the child component. So if you see, the default value of username in child component is changed test username, but from parent I am passing this text, that is I am from parent, and this is being shown on the UI. So this is one utilization of at the rate API. One more utilization of at the rate API is that let's say you have certain variable, or let's say you have certain attributes which you want to expose to your app builder page. So let's say you have a text box, same way, like let's say I have a username text box and I want to capture the value of username when I'm setting the component in the app builder. So basically I want to take the input during the configuration in app builder. That in that scenario as well, we can use at the rate API. So the same way, like I have this Lightning Web component where I have one attribute named as at the rate API. Now, the important thing we need to note is we need to make certain configurations in the meta file. That is, you need to configure the target configs. Okay, so after you set your target configs and whatever the targets you have, so in my case I have kept as a record page, so that whenever I will drag and drop this component on any record page, I will be getting an option to provide a value in the app builder, and that value will get tagged to the username attribute which I have. So username, as you know, I have made it as at the rate API. So now this is become public, and whatever value I will be entering, it will directly go and get tagged to the username, and it will again can be shown on the UI. So in target config under property, first thing you need to give is the attribute with which you want to tag the value which you are sending from app builder. Second thing is what is your label, and what is your type of the attribute. So it can be string, it can be integer. So based on your requirement, you can keep anything. Then you have something called description. So you can provide a description of your variable so that any user, when he will over on the I icon or help text icon, he will see the description. So it is basically to give a user friendly message that why this variable is being used. Now, so this is the configuration which we do to expose a particular JavaScript variable in the app builder. Now, if I show you on the UI, so this is the app builder page for my account. And if I search here my Lightning Web component, which we were discussing just now, and if I drag and drop on the app builder, now you can see that I am getting a text box. Okay, so this is the text box which has been declared as @API. So whatever the property we have defined in meta file, that is my this property. So this property is now giving me a text box where whatever value I will be entering, that will get tagged to username. So for example, let's say if I am making some change here, let's say if I want to give some value, let's say I am from app builder. Okay, so now since this got tagged from the app builder, so in app builder I have provided a value called I am from app builder, and this got tagged to username. Okay, so now the username is having value as whatever we have given in the app builder, and since this username is being referred on the UI like in a reactive manner, so whatever value we pass there, it started showing on the UI. So you can see here that whatever value I have given, let me quickly expand it a little bit. Yeah, so if you can see whatever the value we had provided in the app builder, that is I am from app builder, this started getting displayed. So this is also one of the use case of @API decorator, that you can expose any variable to app builder so that you can capture the data while setting the component on your pages. Let's say it can be a record page or it can be a home page. So that is also one of the use case of @API. So overall, if we see, @API is basically to make any function or any attribute as public in nature so that it can be utilized outside your Lightning Web component, so that it can be referred from outside of Lightning Web component. Now our third decorator is @wire, or we call it as wire decorators. So what wire decorators do? So wire decorators is a way to provide a stream of data into your web components. So wire is a way that you can get a set of data in a reactive manner. Okay. Now whatever the data you get in the wire decorator, they are immutable in nature. That means you cannot modify those data. They are immune from any kind of modification. Okay. Now, any wire property or any wire decorator is majorly works on adapters. So what are adapters? Adapters are basically your data source from where wire is going to fetch the data. Okay. So if we see the syntax of any wire function, okay, so wire functions are having two parameters into it. One is your adapter ID, another one is your adapter configuration. Okay, so what adapter ID is? Adapter ID is basically your data source from where you are going to get the data. Okay, and adapter configuration is any kind of parameters which you will be passing to the adapter to get the data. So if we see in a simple terms, I have a method called get accounts in my account controller. Okay, and I have used a statement called import accounts from my apex get accounts method. So here accounts becomes my adapter ID. This means that I am telling to a wire decorator that hey, accounts is your data source from where you are going to fetch the data. Now, the second part of the parameter, if you see, we have given the adapter configuration. That is in curly braces, we have given what is the input which we are passing to the get account function. Okay, so in my case, it's going to be an account name. It's a string type parameter and it's an account name. And if you see, I'm assigning it to a value with dollar first name. Okay, so what dollar first name do? Dollar is something which makes your wire method a reactive. So any change happening on the first name, okay, it will be absorbed by your framework, and wire will detect that yes, there is a change in the value of first name attribute with the help of dollar. Okay, so in simple terms, if I tell, let's say you have a text box, okay, and in text box you are entering a value, and as soon as you enter a value, the value of the text box you are assigning to the variable that is your first name. Okay, now as soon as you assign it to the first name, your system or your framework basically detects that there is a change in the value of first name. Okay, that detection is happening via dollar. Okay, so by using the dollar, your wire decorator detects that yes, there is a change in the first name value, and hence it refires or it basically reconnects to your adapter ID and get a fresh set of data. Okay, so this is the use of dollar first name. You can keep it as you can give any static variable as well, that's not an issue, but dollar is something which we use to make the wire as reactive and to get a fresh stream of data or fresh data as soon as any change happens in my attribute values. So if we try to see this in action, let's say i have I have already created one controller. Okay, I'll give you a controller overview as well. So once you define any controller method for wire, it has to be cacheable. Then only you can utilize in your wire decorators. So I have created a method called get accounts, and I have make it as cacheable. So this is whatever the data is being returned, they are immutable in nature. Now I have an input parameter named as account name here. Okay, now if we see in the code, okay, I have first defined the adapter. I have first defined the adapter ID, you can say, or you can call it as adapter, that is my accounts. Okay, so I'm using this statement called import accounts from the parameter from my apex class. Okay, so this is an apex class syntax, and I'm assigning it to a variable name as account ID. So this is my adapter ID, which I am using as first parameter in the wire decorator. Next is my configuration. Okay, so in configuration, you can see that my left hand side will be the parameter name which you are using in the method. So here, if you see, my parameter name is account name, and same I am using here. It is an account name. On the right side, what will be the value of your account name? Okay, which I have defined with dollar username. Now, next thing is I have username on my UI. So if you see, I have a input text box, and whenever I am making any change, I am updating the first name method here. Okay, so basically I am updating the username attribute with the value what is present in the text box. So if I show on the UI, okay, so this is my text, okay, where I have a text box, and let's say if I'm making a change to this text box. So as soon as I made any change, okay, my event got fired and the text box value got assigned to the username. Okay, this means this has changed the value of username attribute, which in turn has been detected by the wire method using the dollar. Okay, and as soon as it detects that there is a change in the value of the attribute, okay, it fires the adapt it basically called the adapter and got a fresh set of data. So this is how your wire method works. Okay, I hope you must have got an overview of what wire method is and how it's working. Okay, now there are two ways of attaching a wire. So you can attach a wire directly to any attribute by using account list. If you can see, I have my first syntax where using with variable, and you are defining your wire adapter and directly assigning to a account list. So whatever data is being returned, it will directly go and get assigned to the account list variable of your JavaScript. Okay. Now you might be seeing certain scenarios where before assigning to a list or uh, before utilizing the data which you are getting in response, you need to perform certain functions or certain actions. Okay, so to do that, instead of attaching the wire response directly to an attribute, we basically attach it to a function. And in function there will be two parameters, one is your error and another one is your data. So data is the actual data which you have received as a response of the wire callout. Okay, so whatever the data you will be getting, it will be stored in the data variable. Similarly, if any error occurred during the execution of wire method or wire decorator, if any error happens, that error gets stored in your error variable. Okay, and then since it is in a function, you can use your condition first to check whether the data is present, whether your call is success, and then you can perform your action, and then finally you can assign it to the list. So this is the difference, or this is the way of using the wire adapter, either with a variable or with a function, depends on your requirement. So I hope it will be clear to you now what is the wire and what are the different decorators we have in Lightning Web Component. So with this, we will wrap up today's video, and thanks for your time. We will see you in the next video. Thank you.